Hi, everyone. Um, my name is Teleia White. I am Director of Individual Giving for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library Foundation, and we are so happy to have you join us this lunchtime hour. And I also want to introduce our other two panelists, which are Karen Beach, who our Deputy Director for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library Foundation, and Gavin Edwards, who is our featured author this afternoon. And we'll get to know them a little bit better in a few minutes, but I just wanted to let you know that if you have questions at any point in time during this presentation, please put them in the Q&A box, and that is available, and we'll pull those questions out towards the end and ask them to our panelists so that we can get your questions answered. We are going to do a quick simple, easy ways that you can include someone in your will, and kind of some different options for you to include folks either in your will or leave them as a beneficiary. And then we will turn it over to Gavin, who is going to talk a little bit about his experience in writing obituaries for the New York Times, and then how you can use that to write an obituary for a loved one, so that you can take his experience and use that for your own. So let's get started here with just what is a will, which is a property or assets given. A bequest is property or assets given through a will, and this can be anything from real estate to jewelry to money. I'm sure that you are probably aware of some of these, but there's quite a long list of things that you can leave if you want to be really detailed, or you can do just all of your assets in one. You can make a general request to your favorite charity with a simple statement. I give an amount or a percentage to the organization name. Typically, it's good to include the tax ID or its successor to be used for the unrestricted needs of an organization. You can also direct your bequest for a specific purpose or leave it unrestricted. And a specific purpose, especially when you're dealing with charities, could be something very specific, depending on the type of charity that it is. It could be, for example, with a library, you want it to go towards children's literacy or adult literacy, or it can be left unrestricted, and that gives the charity the most freedom to do the biggest priorities that they need at that point in time. And then, of course, bequests can be changed and updated as you revise your will. So things that you might want to consider when you're drafting your will is to create an inventory of everything that you own, including all of your financial assets. That includes your retirement accounts and any investment accounts that you have. Decide who you want to take care of. Is that your children, your pets, friends, or specific causes that you really are passionate about? You can also name your beneficiaries that you'll be including with bequests. And again, those can include people and charities. It's helpful if you include, when you include a charity, to provide them a copy of that specific page of your will, so that when they are going, after you pass away, they'll know exactly what you wanted to have happen with the money that you have left. And now you also would want to select and notify your executor, who will be responsible for making sure that your wishes are carried out. And then you also need to consider how you want to draft your will. Is that going to be working with an estate planner or an attorney, or are you a do-it-yourselfer and want to do an online service? Any of those are appropriate. You just need to determine which one works best for you. And then, of course, you want to review and update your estate plan regularly. So when you're working with your estate plan, you want to make sure that the charity still exists, and that as people change and go in and out of your life, you may want to determine if you need to include them still. And now I'm going to turn it over to Karen Beach, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about your other types of assets that you can include in your will.
Thanks everybody for being with us today. And just very quickly before we get to Gavin, there's some easy ways that you can make a really significant difference to causes that you may care about. And a few of those would be retirement assets. If you have an IRA or any kind of other retirement asset, life insurance is something that you can think about. And then donor advised funds. Teleia, next slide, please. So we like to say that these are kind of simple ways that you can really make a difference, because it generally involves a piece of paper. There's some paperwork. So you want to, contact your retirement plan administrator or that insurance company or bank or whatnot. Generally, there's some kind of change of beneficiary form when you initially set something up, or if you just change your mind over time. So it can be a really simple way of just contacting those administrators, ask for a change of beneficiary form. Again, you're going to make some decision on how you're determining how you want to split up those assets, and then return that form. And so it becomes a really quick kind of 1, 2, 3, and you're not having to, involve a lot of time or energy into making those changes. Like anything else, kind of determining how you want your charitable gift to be used is really important. So again, think about, you can either be restricted or unrestricted. Unrestricted gifts, I will just tell you, if we hope at some point you might consider the library. The way we typically use unrestricted gifts, they are just added to the libraries, to our endowment fund, to grow and help support kind of innovations for the future and the priorities at that time. But again, gifts could be designated to a specific fund or purpose. And you would want to check with the charity of your choice to see how what options you might have with them. And of course, as Teleia said, it's always great if you feel comfortable, sharing a copy of your plans with whatever charities you might include. Which gets me to the all important, I think it might be the next slide, and that is, have a conversation with the Charities Development Office to ensure your desires are met. This is so important as you're thinking about what's important to you, is because I'll tell you, the fundraisers on this size, we always want to make sure that we're meeting donor intent. And if we don't quite understand that, while we still have an opportunity to talk with you, that's always really important. Or just help phrase things, word things, such that, in the future, your desires can still be met. So again, having a conversation, which can be, doesn't have to be scary, can be really, really simple, is something that we always really encourage you to think about. Next slide. So for the library, we obviously hope that you all might consider at some point considering the library as part of your estate plans. We have a legacy giving society. We call it the Dewey Circle. It's named for our first librarian, Lacey Dewey. We get to the Dewey Circle. It's also a little play on words of the Dewey Decimal System. So our Dewey Circle, and joining us really is obviously some important reasons are impacting future library users. We also love if people join the Dewey Circle and let us share your stories that can help inspire others to consider a similar idea. We always invite you to special events, and we have a really simple form that lets folks tell us your desires and intent. We have a really simple intention form that can be found on our website. It's non-binding. Again, it just gives us a sense of maybe what you're thinking, what you're planning, and what your intentions might be. So we'd encourage you to check that out. And with that, Teleia, I think I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Let me switch over to the next slide. So now I would like to introduce our featured author, Gavin Edwards, who has written countless articles for a wide array of magazines and newspapers, including a dozen cover stories for Rolling Stone and numerous obituaries for the New York Times on notable people ranging from musician Dr. John to chess champion Vera Minchik. He is also the New York Times bestselling author of 14 books ranging from Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters, Now More Than Ever, to the Tao of Bill Murray, Real Life Stories of Joy, Enlightenment, and Party Crashing. His next book, MCU, The Rise of Marvel Studios, will be published in November of 2023, and he's currently working on a book about the card game Magic: The Gathering titled Chaos Orb. Formerly a resident of New York, London, and Los Angeles, he now lives with his family in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he can be found online at Mr. Gavin Edwards on Twitter and Instagram, or on his own website, rule42.com. So welcome, Gavin. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I appreciate you having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about My experience writing obituaries, mostly for the New York Times, and then I'm going to segue from that into the lessons I've learned from it and how you can apply it in your own lives. So most of my obituary writing is for the New York Times, but I've also done some for the Washington Post. I've also done some for Rolling Stone, and sort of obituaries have been around a long time, but the model has changed slightly in the last few years because there's much more of an emphasis for these publications on get online fast. It's not enough to sort of get in the newspaper the next day or the next week. When people hear that somebody died, they want to like sort of click right away and get it. And because of the algorithms, that mean you need to get it up as quickly as possible. So Rolling Stone actually has had these meetings where everybody gets very depressed because they realize how many of like the classic rock stars are getting up there, and at a certain point there's just going to be sort of like many of them dying. But they commissioned a few years ago, they wanted just like 500-word stubs ready to go on different stars, which they could use someday, and they would expand them out if somebody important dies. And so I actually wrote one for Keith Richards that began, Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones guitarist, previously believed to be indestructible, died today, yada, yada, yada. And I think I wrote that 10 years ago. And of course, Keith is still alive because he's never, ever going to die. But I've written about 25 obituaries for the Times. And a few of them, as I get the call, like, hey, somebody just died. The most recent one was Tom Verlaine, the guitarist for the band Television, and they needed something quickly. But sometimes I get a call because somebody died overnight, and someone else, there was one time where it was like somebody was manning the London desk who was much more of a hard news person. And so there was this very like sort of bullet point obituary of the lead singer of Roxette. And an editor said like, look, this needs somebody who can actually, sort of be sympathetic to like her and like the music that she did, sort of like why people cared about her rather than just the bare bones of her life. And so that's what I try to add, that, sort of like a lot of what I'm doing is, sort of like that because I'm coming at it, I'm writing mostly about musicians and my background is in music writing. What I can bring is, sort of like sympathy to like, what did they do? Why do we care about them? What is the impact that they made? So the rules of thumb for Times obituaries is oh, I'm sorry. So I was going to say, so occasionally I get these, sort of like, like quick, sort of you've got a couple hours or, like maybe, 6 hours, get it done so we can get it into the paper for tomorrow. But of the 25 that I've written, the vast majority would be what they call long lead obituaries, where, somebody's getting up there in years. We sort of like want it on file just in case. And then once it's in, like it can be there, like sort of like on file for years and years and years. You occasionally get the situation where this happened with Katharine Hepburn, that when somebody dies who outlives the obituary writer. So she was a front page obituary, but like her obit had been written many years before by Vincent Canby, the film critic for the Times. And I remember it ran, I'm like, wait, how did he write this? He's been dead for 3 years. So the general rule of thumb that the Times goes for is notable people over 70 years old. So the idea being both like sort of like the hard actuarial facts of death that, sort of people over 70 are more likely to die. And then just the feeling that most people have accomplished, sort of like most of what they're going to do by the age of 70. And this isn't 100% true. Sometimes I'll write something and, sort of somebody like Elton John say, will then have, sort of like more hit singles and I have to, sort of go in and tinker with it, or they'll be in the news for some other reason. But the idea is that you can sort of, mostly sum up what they've done. So some of the people who obits I've written include Kim Shattuck of the Muffs, Dr. John, the New Orleans musician, Nancy Griffith, the country folk singer, Charlie Watts, the drummer for the Rolling Stones. And so in each case, sort of like I immerse myself, get as much information as I can on the person. In many cases, there's an autobiography you can read, not always, and you can't take everything in it at face value. You have to sort of like check with other sources. But it's good to just, sort of like, from my point of view, I want to be an expert on the person that day. And so this also gives me opportunity to, sometimes I'm sifting through the different stories from over the years. So like I included this story about Charlie Watts, which was one of the most famous anecdotes about him. There was one time when Mick and Keith of the Rolling Stones were, sort of like, the whole band's in Amsterdam, and sort of like Mick and Keith go out and like they get drunk and they come back to like a hotel room, and Mick, for whatever reason, sort of like the middle of the night, calls up Charlie on the hotel phone. Is like, "Hey, where's my drummer? Where's my drummer?" And about 20 minutes later, there's a knock on the door, and Charlie, who was woken up, had got out of bed, put on, sort of like a suit and tie, shaved, was 100% professional, and says to Mick, "Never call me your drummer again," and punches him. And according to Keith, like Mick nearly like falls out the window, like into like a canal beneath. Now, the thing was, the story was so good that like it got improved over the years, that, sort of like there's versions of it out there where, sort of like Charlie says, "You are my singer," or like has like other like withering put downs. But I could go back and see like the original versions of the story and see that like none of those details were there originally. Just it was irresistible for people trying to add things. But I do as much research as I can. There's one case where I did the three songwriters all at once, Holland, Dozier Holland, the Motown songwriters. And in that case, the editor said, "Listen, sort of there's, if you're researching one of their lives, you're basically researching all three. So write all three." And it was this fascinating challenge because I had to write three obituaries that got, like many of the same basic facts overlapped, but making sure it was not just like cut and paste in each case. And when there was sort of like figuring out, exactly what each of them did in the partnership, and which anecdotes that went into it seemed to like associate best with, like Brian Holland versus Lamont Dozier versus Eddie Holland. And I've also done obituaries on, sort of like notable people, women who never got obituaries in the first place because of like the past biases of newspapers and the Times obituary section. So there's like things that happened decades ago, like the first women's chess champion Vera Menchik never got an obituary. This fascinating woman named Rose Mackenberg was actually a ghostbuster. She worked with Houdini to like expose these fake psychics who were exploiting people. And so it's great in those cases to be able to sort of like, really dive in and tell their story. So I look at obituary writing, I'm basically writing a short biography. It's, like not that different from, sort of like in a book, I've got a, sort of 100,000 words. In an obituary, I've got, somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000. But the impulse is the same. The idea is that I'm diving in and telling somebody's story as best I can. And I love it. It's one of the favorite things that I do. And I think like, it feels almost like it's a moral calling for me, which may sound overblown, I recognize. But a lot of the writing I do for pop culture is very much like, hey, sort of here's what it's like to be backstage with this person, or here's what it's like to ride the tour bus with the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And when I write an obituary, I feel like I have the job of summing up somebody's life. And it feels like that's important. And, for like, especially writing for the Times, for a lot of people, that's going to be, sort of the paper of record, and that's going to like represent who they were. So I try to do everything I can to get it right. So a couple of years ago, my dad died during the pandemic, and I never wrote, sort of like, sort of like the newspaper obituary, but I did write, sort of like a long Facebook post, which I realized after the fact was really just like me writing his obituary. And I hadn't even thought of it as like applying what I had learned to like my personal life, but I realized after the fact, like, oh, that's what it was. And so I'm going to sort of like talk about like sort of what I learned from doing that and how the lessons applied, because, you know, sort of like there will probably come a day when you need to write an obituary, and, you know, sort of like that doesn't, you know, sort of when it's the paid notice in the newspaper, that's kind of its own thing, that, you know, sort of like you're paying them by the word. There's a certain amount of just like the basic facts you have to get in, and, you know, sort of like here's, you know, sort of like when like the memorial service is, and, you know, sort of like, you know, like in lieu of flowers, etc. But there's a lot of other ways you can write an obituary. And, you know, like it could be, in my case, it was a Facebook post, or it could be like an email blast to like lots of people that you know. But you want to sit down and you want to let people know like who this person was. And I sort of like, for me, that weekend, it was just one of the things I had to do. I had to make funeral arrangements. I had to do this and that. But it happened at a time when, because of the pandemic, like there was no like in-person memorial service, but it was actually really like healing for me. That, you know, sort of like it gave me the time to sort of like think about my father and think about like what he meant and who he was and like how he carried himself. And so it was like I was really glad that I got to spend a couple of hours doing that. So I'm going to try to pass on some of the things I learned from that. So number one is be kind, but also be truthful. You know, sort of like you probably, you know, like the person is gone, they can't defend themselves, but there's also no point in, you know, sort of like ignoring like who they actually were. And I think in almost all cases, like it is totally possible to do both. I always start when I'm writing anything like this, writing down like the best stories I have about this person. And, you know, sort of like you're certainly going to like, you know, need to get in the basic facts of their lives. You know, like my father grew up in Bath, England. He went to school here. He moved to New York City then. He worked for this company. But, you know, sort of like the stories that I remembered about, you know, sort of like the times like he sort of fell through the roof, or the times we went to a Yankees game together and things happened. Like those were the things that really meant something to me. And I think those are the things that are going to mean things to other people. If you have even just like 3 good stories about somebody, and you sort of like, you know, sort of put 2 of them in chronologically in this obituary or this letter or whatever it is that you're writing, and you save the last one to like be a kicker that like sort of like wraps it up because it says something about that person, how they carried themselves, then like you're halfway done. And so it's worth just sort of like, what do you remember about this person? What stories do you remember? And similarly, you know, sort of like the quirky details that like, you know, like my dad worked for computer companies at a time when it was, you know, sort of like they used punch cards. It was like big mainframe computers in the 1970s. And so when I was growing up, we always had, you know, sort of like these, you know, like punch cards about yay big, and they were like what we used for scratch paper by the phone. And it was just sort of like this like weird technological artifact of another time. And it was just something, when I put it in, like so many people who read it said, yes, like my family had that too. That, you know, sort of like it said something about who he was, and people respond to quirky details like that. It helps like get into make a connection with this other person's life. It's okay to get personal. You know, you're writing this, you can talk about like the why you love the person, or why you fell out with them, or, you know, sort of like, you know, it doesn't have to be like dry and objective. It's you talking about a major person in your life. And it's okay to leave things out. You know, when I write a book, as I mentioned, it's 100,000 words. I'm going to talk to everybody. I'm going to include everybody. But when I write for the New York Times, you know, sort of like obituaries never really get shorter than 1,200 words, but they also never really get longer than about 2,000. You could be like one of the biggest music stars of all time, and that's, you know, like as long as it's going to go. And I learned early on that, you know, sort of like I can't get in, let's do Charlie Watts, every single, you know, like Rolling Stones tour or album or single, that I'm going to have to make choices and, you know, sort of like, it's okay to say they had 37 or whatever albums, and sort of pick a few that tell the story that you're trying to tell. You do not have to get everything across in this. So, I would say that, like, as you're doing it, just sort of like, it's okay to like talk to other people about it, but just, like, it doesn't have to be a chore. It can be something that, sort of like, it can be just like one of the best ways that you can remember somebody. And I'm always honored when I get to do it, and I was glad that I got to do it in my own family as well. And I think that's basically it. So I am happy to. I know if you have questions about giving, Karen and Teleia are both here to help you. If you have questions for me about obituary writing, or if you just want to know about like any of my books or anything else, I'm also happy to answer them. So here we all are, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Gavin. That was really great. Why don't I start off? I was just curious if you are, do you have any tips for someone who might want to write their own personal obituary? Like, could they, or if leave, could someone leave information behind for, any thoughts on when you've done research on celebrities that you've had to write obituaries on? Was there any kind of information that maybe helped guide you, or that somebody could leave behind? Like, this is really important to include.
Sure. So I will say two things. One is that, sort of like, there's a version of this that's the sort of like score settling from beyond the grave, right? Sort of like, I need my sister to know that, like, I always resented her for X, Y. If that's what you've got to do, then that's what you've got to do. I'm not getting in your way. I will say that, sort of like, it can be lovely just to write some version of an autobiography of yourself. And, sort of like, it can be daunting to say I'm going to write a whole book about myself, but, sort of like, there's nothing wrong with like writing a long letter saying like, here's some of the basic facts of my life. When I go to celebrities' autobiographies, so often the facts I'm looking for are, sort of like, what were their parents' names? What were their parents' jobs? What are the facts of their childhood? There's these things that, so like, the way this applies to your life is that, you have secrets of your own that you may not have told everybody, or that, so maybe you told them 3 years ago or 30 years ago and they've forgotten. But you are also very possibly the only living connection to the generations that came before you. And it is a blessing to your descendants if you can say, here's like some of the things you don't know about my parents and my grandparents and where we came from and what it is. Because very often family history like fizzles out after a few generations. And if you can keep it going, then I think you've really done something for like the people coming after you.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get started. We have lots of questions. What is your favorite celebrity to write about, or who was, and who is alive that you'd love to write about if they pass away?
So I'm trying. I love. It was particularly fun. I had a really, I mean, there's been a lot, and just like anytime, sort of I show up somewhere and like it's like a lively conversation, then great. I particularly remember, just off the top of my head, when I interviewed Quentin Tarantino for Rolling Stone, and he's a very bright, sparky, talkative guy. And there was this moment when he was talking about, I asked him, sort of like, what movies he'd been watching, because that's the way that you engage him. And he talked about these like Canadian horror movies, and he's like, oh, and there's this one that they actually like filmed in Canada, but they made it set in Canada, and sort of it's a portrait of sort of like like depressed Canadian small town. And it's like, oh, the same way that like Slapshot like looks like a hockey comedy, but it's actually like sort of like shows you like what the Rust Belt was like in that era. And his eyes lit up because I had returned serve, like somebody who can like talk film geek with him. And that's like when it sort of opens up. So that for me is like the real pleasure in, sort of like interviewing people when you find like sort of this common ground and like you're getting a lively conversation. I always used to say that the person I most wanted to interview was Peter O'Toole, just because he seemed like sort of like fabulously entertaining. I would love to talk, sort of like, I don't know if like Beyonce has ever done like sort of like a real, I mean, she's one of the world's most famous people, but if she would like ever got to a point in her life where she really wanted to say like, here's what I really think, like I would want to be there to hear that. So
Me too. um, Raymond wants to know what you thought of Scott Fowler's obituary of Jerry Richardson. He said this is a classic case of how to handle the negative aspects of someone's life. It was especially tricky one to handle given the positive parts of his legacy.
I thought he did a really good job. I mean, and it's I think it's, I find this now, sort of like in my work, that many of the rock stars I'm writing about, societal attitudes have changed. Sort of like we are, I think, correctly, sort of like less likely to turn like a blind eye to domestic abuse or sort of like sexual exploitation, and like, and this is good, this is progress, and sort of like, but it presents an interesting challenge for me when I write about rock stars who there's this stuff that like is in the public record, but that everyone always says, oh, it was 1972. And so I find that the best way to do it is just lay it out in a straightforward way as possible. And I think, sort of Scott similarly did a good job with that. Like it was not, sort of like moralizing, but like, hey, here's like the facts of this person's life, and like, here's what you need to know. And, sort of like, and you don't even have to say this was good and this was bad. Most of the time, sort of people can figure that out for themselves.
And then do you have any thoughts about talking with elder parents about what they might want in their obituary, or maybe even creating a draft together?
I mean, I would say that's a great idea. And, sort of like, it is a great idea, not just because it leads to, sort of like a better, richer document, but like you're going to have a conversation that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Like, I mean, the people, like can get weirded out about thinking about their obituaries, honestly, but they also, sort of like, it can get them to open up. There's this wonderful Time story that this happened like decades ago, about there's some like junior reporter on the obits desk, who was assigned the obituary of some like sort of like dowager of like the Upper East Side, and is sort of calls up to like, and is sort of nervously fact checking, like, oh, we just want some facts on file, and she says, young man, is this for my obituary? And he's like, well, yes, it is. Very well. Come have lunch with me tomorrow and I'll tell you everything. And so there's, for a lot of people, it's, conversation that they're maybe not going to, sort of bring up themselves, but if they're asked, they're happy to be asked. And so, like, and if they don't want to talk about it, then that's fine. But I think it's great if you can like bring people in earlier on.
Great. Can you tell us about, you've got two books, one that you are almost is at the publishing point, about to come out, and then the one that you're writing on the gathering. So can you share both of those?
Sure.
And what do we need to know?
Sure. Well, this file right here, this is MCU, the Marvel book. So I did this one with two co-authors, and it's a history of Marvel Studios. So how did they build, sort of like, this organization that made, sort of like 30 hit movies and took over the world. And it is what you just saw there is what they call first pass pages. Which ironically is the last time an author gets to look at the book. It's called first pass because it's the first time they put the manuscript down on the page as it will be typeset. So you can have what, so from my point of view, it's one final chance to like go through it and say, oh, like the comma shouldn't be there, or like, oh, there's a factual error, let's cut that. So that is being published by Norton, the Norton Anthology of Poetry People. Which turns out is the largest independent publisher still standing, and it's going to be out in November. Sort of like I think it came out sort of informative and entertaining, and so if you're at all interested in the subject, I hope you get it. And then I'm still in the reporting stage on the other book, which is about the card game Magic: The Gathering, and it's called Chaos Orb, which is a reference to a famous Magic card that there's all this lore about because allegedly someone once ripped up a copy during a tournament so it would fall down onto the other cards and interact with them in interesting ways. So I've interviewed, sort of like champions and designers, and I actually went out to Seattle a week before last and spent time following around behind the scenes at the headquarters of the company that makes it, Wizards of the Coast, which no reporter has ever done before. So I feel like I'm getting good material, and it's a subculture, but it's a huge subculture, and it's got like 30 years of history. So I'm still at the stage where I'm gathering information, figuring out the, sort of like, okay, I've got, sort of like much more material than it can ever fit into the book. How do you narrow it down and like tell the story that you want to tell? So that's what that's keeping me busy right now.
How do you decide on your subject matter for books?
So whenever anyone asks me this question, I draw a Venn diagram. Looks like the MasterCard logo, but sort of like there we go. So we've got two circles, and the one on the left is things I care about, and the one over here is things that other people care about. The goal is to get that sweet spot in the middle. Sort of if it's just something that sort of like other people like, but I don't care, it's going to be a stone in my shoe for like the year or two that I'm working on the book. And if it's something that sort of like I think is the greatest thing in the world, but it's very hard to convince people so there are some things that I can do just as pure passion projects, but maybe that's better as a magazine article or like even like a blog post, or sort of like so like I could spend a week trying to say this thing is amazing, pay more attention to it. But if I write a book, it doesn't do anyone any good if people are not predisposed to it. So I'm trying to write things that like I find. The other way I thought about it once early in my career was I said I want big American stories, and I think that still holds true. Finding things that sort of like have a lot to them that people connect with, and that says something about who we are as well.
Cool. Okay, we've got one more question here, it looks like, and that is, how many obituaries do you read a day?
Oh, I guess just 2 or 3. I read the Times section. I don't, sort of every now and then, I guess if it's somebody I deeply care about, sort of like, David Bowie dies and that's like a gut punch. And so I'm going to read everything I can about him. And some of them will be factual and some of them will be appreciations, but they're all obituaries. But otherwise, like I'm old fashioned. I still, get the print newspaper, and, sort of like the obituary page is not the first one I read, but I'm always like curious about it. It partially in just kind of like an inside baseball kind of way for me, like, oh, like Peter wrote that. I didn't know they'd put him on. So I'm checking on my colleagues' work. But I often find that I'm fascinated to learn about somebody I didn't know about previously.
Cool. Well, Gavin, thank you so much for sharing your upcoming work with us, and then also your tips for gathering and drafting an obituary. I think it's really important, especially to be thinking about it before a loved one passes away, so that
Absolutely.
you're ready and prepared. So I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And I'm going to just close out with just a few things. I wanted to share with you all that we have lots of things coming on this spring. We have on May 6th, we have a festival style event that will be going to each branch. It kicks off on May 6th, and it's an event called Around the World in 21 branches. And it starts at North County from 11 to 2. We'd love for as many of you that can to join us there. And then we will be going to each branch. And so you're welcome to come to one or all of them. So I'd love to have you there. We also have our final draft series that's coming back. We have 3 authors that will be in person at Town Brewing, and one virtual. Our first author is Jay Ward, who will be joining us at Town Brewing on May 2nd. He is a poet. We also have Lee Smith, who will be joining us virtually on May 17th. And we have 3 authors coming in June to Town Brewing: Joy Calloway, Kim Wright, and Erica Montgomery. And finally, we will close out our final draft season with Barbara Johnson, who will be joining us in July. And I also wanted to make you aware of Verse and Vino, which will be happening. It is our 10th anniversary. It's not to be missed. We'll have lots of really entertaining authors, and that is November 2nd. So I hope you'll join us. If you've come before, we'd love to have you come back. If you haven't come, this is a great year to be a part. We're going to have lots of fun on November 2nd. And Megan Miranda will be at the May 6th event. And so we would love to have you join us at all of these events. So check out our website, foundation.cmlibrary.org, and that will have all the information on planned giving, as well as these upcoming events. And that information is also in the chat for you as well. So thank you for joining us today. And if you have any other questions that we didn't get to, I'll make sure to catch up with Gavin and get those questions answered. Thank you so much.